I'm not going to give a whole long presentation, but the name of my paper is American Hip Hop Defines Vietnamese Communism. Vietnamese Communist History. Ho Ho Chi Minh. More than half a century after his death, Ho Chi Minh is still revered by leftists as a hero, a patriot, and nationalist, the celibate, benign, and priestly Uncle Bach Ho, and the George Washington of his country. A closer look reveals him to have been an unscrupulous communist Ho, and I'm taking this in hip-hop sense, paid by Moscow, whose loyalty was not to the Vietnamese people, but to the world communist movement, the Comintern. As a communist internationalist taking orders from Moscow, he sought to emulate his hero, the butcher Joseph Stalin, by creating a Southeast Asian Communist Union. Now in the paper I have 8 sections in it, and I'll just give a very brief on this. Number 1 is Ho's Life of Lies. Born Nguyen Sinh Cung, he stole the name the world remembers, Ho Chi Minh, from a dead man. Researchers have documented that Ho used some 150 to 167 different names to disguise his identity. Ho carefully chose and stole names to aggrandize himself, such as Uncle Bach Ho. In Vietnamese, a very reverent pronoun form. Ho Chi Minh, one who enlightens, and Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot. They're all stolen names. He's not authentic, he never was, and he never will be. The only thing that is authentic is there's a bag of bones and a glass entombment in Hanoi. Ho's Life of Lies, born Nguyen Sinh Cung, I already repeated that, I'm sorry. Ho, the liar and literary thief. He was a plagiarizer and literary thief who put his name on several papers, books, and poems, e.g. prison diaries written by others, and stories of President Ho's life and revolutionary activities, which was written by Tran Dan Tien, one of Ho's many aliases. He fabricated and wrote his own biography, extolling and praising himself to repletion. He writes his own biography. He's the one that created the whole image of Uncle Ho. Such a nice guy. Ho and the OSS, his involvement with the OSS during World War II can be summed up as much ado about nothing. If one knows anything about Shakespeare, it was a comedy, but in the case of Ho Chi Minh, it was a black comedy. Ho and his people rescued only one American pilot and immediately turned him over to the Vichy French, who was collaborating with the Japanese for reward money, and the pilot was imprisoned. The next is Ho the Betrayer. Ho developed a nasty habit of betraying true Vietnamese nationalists and their leaders. Those who weren't outright murdered, Ho saw to it that their names and whereabouts were sold to the dreaded French charity for blood money to fund the expansion of the Communist Party, including Phan Boi Chau in 1925. Ho called this selling of the pigs. Ho's bloody hands. He was responsible, of course, for the deaths of tens of thousands of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians. And today, the suffering of the Vietnamese people under communism today. Ho the Womanizer. Ho was not a celibate saint as he betrayed himself as Uncle Ho, a reputation he achieved by praising himself by writing under a pseudonym. Rather, he was either a bigamist who reportedly had at least 7 mistresses, or just bomb with them. A randy old goat, a more ample modifier of Ho. It is also said that he fathered 6 children by his various mistresses. The next to last portion was Ho, the Khmer Rouge, and the turning of the worm. And to get the turning of the worm, it's both a play on the Chinese who had backed Ho for years, then turned against Ho in driving out the North Vietnamese out of Cambodia. And so Ho's founding of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in 1930 was genesis of the creation of the Khmer Rouge, thus making him complicit in murder of estimated 2 million Cambodians. On December 25, 1978, the Armed Forces of Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia under the pretext of saving the Cambodians from the Khmer Rouge, when in fact it was just a disguised attempt to colonize Cambodia. They stayed for 10 years. According to Colonel Bui Tin, who was a Joseph Goebbels of Nazi fame, he was the equivalent of it for the North Vietnamese communists. The Vietnamese armed forces sacrificed 52,000 dead and over 200,000 wounded, many losing arms and legs from the mines in their incursion into Cambodia. Although he died in 1969, Ho's dream of greater Indochina dominated by Vietnam lives on in the minds of Hanoi's Communist Party members. Hanoi is now neo-colonizing Cambodia through Vietnam's historical strategy of gaining territory, referring to as Dan Dien, military colonization. They demobilized army units that brought their families, relatives, and friends, and are now kept as a ready reserve force in Cambodia. And through the historical strategy of Tay Tien westward movement, Hanoi has established chapters of the United Front for the National Construction and Defense of Cambodia, a cover for Vietnam's fatherland front in all 23 provinces and cities in the country. Cambodian sources say millions of Vietnamese are now occupying our country. Ho's legacy is the last hero, patriot, nationalist, the celibate, benign, and priestly Uncle Ho, the George Washington of Vietnam? Not. Ho Chi Minh's real legacy is that he was a mass murderer who was directly responsible for crimes on the genocidal scale. Since his policies have been carried out on after his death in 1969, Ho also bears the responsibility for the death and suffering of millions of Vietnamese under the 1975 communist takeover of South Vietnam, as well as the Khmer Rouge genocide in which over 2 million Cambodians were murdered, and the deaths of countless numbers of Laotians and Hmong. All have been excused away in the fashion typical of communists and their useful idiots who rationalize that killing millions was necessary for revolution.